My stepdad gave my college money to his actual daughter and bragged about sending me to college. My social media post ruined his credibility. Richard promised he'd pay for my college the day he married my mom. I was 9. He stood in our living room, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "You're my daughter now. I'm going to pay for your education just like a real father would." He said this in front of 20 witnesses at the reception, too. For 8 years, that promise shaped every decision I made. I studied harder knowing college was guaranteed. Took AP classes that destroyed my social life. Skipped parties to maintain a 4.0 GPA. Turned down a job at 16 because Richard said I should focus on academics since money wouldn't be an issue. He'd bring it up constantly. "Don't worry about those application fees, kiddo. I've got your tuition covered." Or, "Apply wherever you want. Price doesn't matter." When guidance counselors asked about financial limits, Richard would jump in. "Sky's the limit. This one's going to the best school that accepts her." My mom would beam every time he said it. Richard made good money as a regional director for a hotel chain. $300,000 a year plus bonuses. He drove a Tesla, bought my mom a Mercedes, took us on vacations to Europe. We lived in a 6-bedroom house with a pool. Money was never discussed as a problem. His biological daughter Haley lived with her mom in Colorado. She visited 2 weeks every summer. Richard paid child support and flew her out, but she was basically a stranger. She was 3 years older than me, already in community college when Richard made his promises about my education. Senior year, I got into Northwestern. $60,000 a year, but Richard had said price didn't matter. I also got into state with a partial scholarship that would have made it $15,000. Richard insisted I go to Northwestern. "You worked for this. You deserve the best." May 1st, decision day. I committed to Northwestern. Put down my deposit using money from my part-time job, started buying dorm supplies, told everyone where I was going, made friends in the accepted students group, found a roommate. August 1st, tuition was due. $20,000 for the first semester. I reminded Richard 2 weeks before. About that, he said at dinner. Haley needs help. Haley had dropped out of community college, gotten pregnant, needed money for an apartment. Richard had given her $60,000, the exact amount for my first year. "You understand, right?" he said. "She's in crisis. You can take out loans." My mom sat there silent. I showed him the texts where he promised to pay, the emails where he told me to pick Northwestern, the video from their wedding where he announced he'd pay for my college. "Plans change," he said. "I have to prioritize my actual daughter." 8 years of calling me his daughter, gone in one sentence. I had 3 weeks until move-in day. Northwestern required payment or they'd drop my enrollment. I couldn't switch to state anymore. Their deadline had passed. I was about to lose everything because Richard decided his actual daughter mattered more. I called my grandmother, my mom's mom. She lived in Florida on Social Security. But she had something else. My grandfather's life insurance policy. $200,000 she'd never touched. She was saving it for end-of-life care. "How much do you need?" she asked. "No, Grandma. I can't take your safety net." "How much?" I told her. $20,000 for the semester. She sent $40,000 the next day, enough for the full year. "Pay me back when you're a doctor," she said, with interest. I didn't tell Richard or my mom about the money. Let them think I'd taken out loans. Moved into Northwestern in September. Richard posted on Facebook about being a proud dad sending his daughter to college. I didn't correct him. October, Haley called me. She was crying. The $60,000 was gone. Her boyfriend had spent it on a truck and gambling. She needed more money. Richard had said no because he'd already given her my college fund. She wanted me to talk to him. "He gave you my college money," I said. "That was all of it." "But you got loans, right? You're fine. I have a baby coming." I hung up. In December, I made the dean's list. Richard posted about it on Facebook again. So proud of my daughter's achievements at Northwestern. His friends congratulated him on raising such a smart kid. That's when I posted my own update. Thank you all for the kind words. I should clarify that Richard is not paying for my education as he promised for 8 years. He gave my college fund to his biological daughter in August. My grandmother, who lives on Social Security, paid my tuition from her life insurance savings. Richard has contributed exactly $0 to my education, but continues to take credit for my achievements. I tagged him and all his friends who'd commented. Within an hour, his phone was blowing up. His boss saw it. His golf buddies. His siblings. Everyone who'd heard him brag for years about paying for my college. He called me screaming. His voice came through the phone like a chainsaw. Every word cut and tore at me. I pulled the phone away from my ear but could still hear him raging about his reputation, his career, his standing in the community. My mom's crying filled the background, this high-pitched sobbing that made my chest hurt. I waited for her to take the phone. Waited for her to tell Richard to calm down. Waited for her to defend me even once. She never did. The crying just continued while Richard screamed about betrayal and humiliation. I pressed the phone back to my ear and let him finish his rant. When he finally paused to breathe, I spoke in the calmest voice I could manage. I told him to delete the post. He demanded it immediately. Said I was lying about everything. Said I made him look like a monster when he'd only tried to help his family. I interrupted him. Every word in that post was true. I had texts, emails, video from his wedding, 8 years of promises documented in writing. He started threatening to cut off all contact. Said I'd never be welcome in his house again. Said I was dead to him. I hung up before he could finish. My hands shook as I set the phone on my desk. 3 knocks hit my door. Maya's voice came through asking if I was okay. She'd heard me on the phone through the wall. I opened the door and she came in wearing her Northwestern sweatshirt and pajama pants. I showed her the Facebook post on my laptop. Explained the whole situation from Richard's wedding promise to Grandma's life insurance payment. Maya read through the comments that were already piling up. She hugged me tight and said I did the right thing. Said Richard deserved to be exposed. Said anyone who breaks promises to kids deserves whatever consequences come their way. We sat on my bed and watched the post explode. Within 2 hours, the comment count hit 300. 200 shares spread it across multiple networks. Most people supported me. They called Richard selfish and cruel. They praised Grandma for stepping up. They questioned how someone making $300,000 a year could abandon his stepdaughter. A few family members defended him. Richard's cousin said family issues should stay private. His aunt said I was being dramatic about a broken promise. His poker buddy said kids these days expect everything handed to them. But they were drowned out by dozens of people calling Richard a liar and a fraud. My phone rang again. Different number. I answered cautiously. Richard's brother introduced himself. Said his name was Tom. Said he'd always suspected Richard was full of hot air about paying for my college. Tom's voice sounded tired and sad. He told me their father did the same thing to Richard years ago. Made big promises about paying for Richard's education, then spent the money on a boat. Richard had to work 3 jobs to get through community college. Tom said he thought Richard would be different. Thought Richard would break the cycle. Guess he was wrong. Tom apologized for not speaking up sooner. Said he should have warned me not to count on Richard's promises. I thanked him for calling and for believing me. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. She said I shouldn't have aired family business publicly. Asked why I didn't come to her first. I stared at that text for 5 full minutes. Then I typed my response. I came to her at dinner when Richard called Haley his actual daughter. I came to her when he gave away my college fund. She sat there silent both times. Never defended me. Never questioned his choices. Just sat there and let him betray me. I hit send and put my phone face down. Another message came through minutes later. This one from Haley. Long paragraphs about how selfish I was. How I was trying to ruin her father's reputation because I was jealous of their relationship. She claimed the $60,000 was always meant for her emergency. Said Northwestern was a luxury school I didn't need. Said I could have gone to community college like she did. Said I was spoiled and ungrateful. Said her baby deserved that money more than I deserved fancy education. I screenshot the message. Saved it to my photos. Maya looked over my shoulder and read it. She suggested I document everything in case this got worse. We created a folder on my laptop. Saved every message, every email, every text. Screenshots of Richard's Facebook posts before he could delete them. Screenshots of all the comments. The video from his wedding where he promised to pay for my education. Everything organized and backed up to cloud storage. Maya said we were building a case file. I didn't know what kind of case, but having documentation felt smart. My Facebook notifications kept pinging. I opened the app and found a new comment from Violet Cameron. She was a family friend who'd known me since I was 9. Her comment said she remembered Richard's wedding speech about paying for my education. Said she was there when he made those promises in front of everyone. Said she believed every word I wrote. Her support meant something because people in Richard's social circle respected her. She ran a successful business and volunteered with 3 charities. When Violet Cameron said something, people listened. Within minutes, her comment had 50 likes. Other people started sharing their own memories of Richard bragging about paying for my college. My phone buzzed with a private message. Carson Daniels, Richard's golf buddy. He apologized for congratulating Richard on my achievements. Said he had no idea Richard wasn't actually helping. Said he felt manipulated by the false narrative Richard had been pushing for years. Carson said he'd been telling everyone at the country club about Richard's generous support of my education. Now he felt like a fool for spreading lies. He asked if there was anything he could do to help. I thanked him but said just knowing the truth was enough. I checked my phone the next morning and found Richard had deleted his Northwestern acceptance post and the Dean's List one too. Both gone from his profile like they never existed. But he was too late. My notifications showed dozens of people had screenshot everything before he could erase it. Maya had saved copies. Carson had saved copies. Violet had saved copies. At least 20 other people commented saying they'd grabbed the evidence before it disappeared. Richard's attempt to hide what he'd done just made him look worse. People started posting in the comments about how suspicious it was that he deleted everything right after my truth post went up. My phone rang around 10 that morning. Unknown number with a local area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice asked if this was me and introduced himself as Tanner Joyce, Richard's boss. He'd seen my post through mutual Facebook connections and wanted to talk about what happened. His tone wasn't angry or accusatory. He sounded genuinely concerned and said he needed to understand the situation better. Would I be willing to meet him for coffee sometime this week? I agreed to meet him the next day at a cafe near campus. The cafe was one of those places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Tanner was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees. He stood up when he saw me and shook my hand. He looked exactly like I'd pictured Richard's boss would look. Professional suit, kind eyes, probably in his 50s. He thanked me for meeting him and slid one of the coffees toward me. Then he got straight to the point. Richard had been bragging at work for years about putting his daughter through Northwestern. Talked about it constantly in meetings and at company events. Made it a big part of his personal brand at the hotel chain. Tanner said the company valued integrity above everything else, and he needed to understand the truth of what really happened. I pulled out my phone and showed him everything. The texts where Richard promised to pay, the emails where he told me to pick Northwestern regardless of cost, the video from his wedding reception where he announced in front of everyone that he'd pay for my college education like a real father would. I showed him the date stamps on everything, 8 years of promises. Then I showed him the text from August where he said plans changed, and he had to prioritize his actual daughter. Tanner's face changed as he read through everything. He looked genuinely disturbed. He kept scrolling back through the messages like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. When he finished, he set my phone down carefully and said this reflected very poorly on Richard's character and judgment, especially for someone in a leadership position who was supposed to model company values. Tanner thanked me for my honesty and said he'd be having a serious conversation with Richard about misrepresenting his personal life to colleagues. He said Richard had used this story about paying for my education to build credibility with clients and employees. Made himself look generous and family-oriented. Now it turned out the whole thing was a lie. Tanner said he appreciated me taking the time to meet with him and show him the documentation. As I walked back to my dorm, I realized Richard's professional reputation was taking real damage from the exposure. This wasn't just social embarrassment anymore. His boss now knew he'd been lying to everyone at work for years. My grandmother called that afternoon. Her voice came through warm and steady like always. She said she'd been hearing about the Facebook drama through various family members and wanted to check on me. I started to apologize for causing problems, but she cut me off. She said she was proud of me for standing up for myself, and I shouldn't feel guilty about accepting her money. That's what family was supposed to do. Help each other when it mattered. She'd been saving that life insurance money for years, and using it to help me get an education was exactly what my grandfather would have wanted. Then she told me something I didn't know. Richard had called her yesterday trying to get her to pressure me into deleting the post. He'd gone on and on about how I was ruining his reputation and making the family look bad. Told her she needed to talk sense into me and make me take it down. My grandmother said she told him she'd do no such thing. Told him he should be ashamed of himself for breaking promises to a child. Said if he wanted his reputation back, he should start by actually keeping his word instead of lying to everyone about what a great father he was. I asked if she was facing any pressure from other family members about giving me the money. She laughed. Actually laughed. Said at 78 years old she was too old to care what people thought. She'd made her decision and she stood by it. Then she told me to focus on my studies and let the adults deal with their drama. She said Richard made his own bed and now he had to lie in it. I told her I loved her and she said she loved me too. After we hung up, I sat there feeling grateful that at least one person in my family had my back unconditionally. My mom called again that evening. This time Richard wasn't in the background. I could tell because her voice sounded different. Quieter. More honest. She said she'd been thinking about everything since my post went up and she needed to admit something. She should have stood up for me at dinner when Richard gave away my college fund. She was shocked and didn't know what to say in the moment, but that wasn't an excuse for her silence. She knew it wasn't right and she should have said something. I told her the truth. Her silence hurt almost as much as Richard's betrayal. I expected him to be selfish because he'd always put himself first. But I thought she would protect me. She was my mom. She was supposed to be on my side. Instead, she just sat there and let him call Haley his actual daughter and give away my future. She started crying, said she'd been trying to keep the peace for years, trying to make the marriage work, trying not to rock the boat. But somewhere along the way, she lost sight of what really mattered. She chose keeping Richard happy over protecting her own daughter, and she was sorry. I didn't know what to say. She was finally admitting what I'd needed to hear for months, but it felt too late. The damage was done. I told her I appreciated the apology, but I needed time to process everything. She said she understood and asked if she could call me again in a few days. I said yes, and we hung up. I sat on my bed staring at my phone for a long time. Maya came back from the library and found me like that. She asked what happened, and I told her about both calls, the one with Grandma and the one with Mom. Maya listened without interrupting and then said something that stuck with me. She said my mom was finally waking up to reality, but that didn't erase 8 years of choosing Richard over me. I had every right to take my time deciding if I wanted to rebuild that relationship. She also said I should be proud of myself for standing up and telling the truth. A lot of people would have stayed silent to keep the peace. I thanked her, and we ordered pizza and watched terrible reality TV to get my mind off everything. The next morning, I woke up to a text from a number I didn't recognize. It turned out to be Richard's sister. She said she'd heard about everything through the family grapevine and wanted to reach out. She apologized for not knowing sooner what Richard had done. She said if she'd known he broke his promise and gave away my college fund, she would have said something immediately. Then she told me she was cutting off contact with Richard until he made things right with me. She said what he did was wrong and she couldn't support that kind of behavior even from her own brother. But the part that really shocked me was at the end of her message. She offered to contribute $5,000 toward my spring semester tuition. She said it wasn't the full amount Richard should have paid, but she wanted to help offset some of the burden on my grandmother. I read the message 3 times trying to process it. $5,000 was a huge amount of money. It would make a real difference in what Grandma had to cover. But I also felt uncomfortable accepting it. Grandma had already sacrificed so much, and now Richard's sister wanted to give me money too. It felt like I was becoming a charity case. I didn't know how to respond, so I called Grandma first. She answered on the second ring, and I told her about the offer. Grandma was quiet for a moment, and then she said something wise. She said accepting help wasn't the same as being a charity case. Richard's sister was trying to do the right thing because her brother had done the wrong thing. That was different from me begging for money or not trying to handle things myself. She said, but she also reminded me that pride could be expensive, and sometimes the smart thing was to accept genuine help when it was offered. I thanked her and said I'd think about it. Then I texted Richard's sister back. I thanked her for reaching out and for the generous offer. I told her I needed some time to think about it and discuss it with my grandmother before making a decision. She responded right away saying she completely understood and to take all the time I needed. The offer would stand whenever I was ready. That same day, finals week started. I had 5 exams spread across 8 days, and I needed to focus. Maya helped by taking my phone during our study sessions and hiding it in her desk drawer. She said I was checking it every 5 minutes and it was killing my concentration. She was right. Every notification made me jump, thinking it might be Richard or Mom or someone else from the family drama. Without my phone, I could actually focus on my notes and textbooks. My first exam was organic chemistry, and it was brutal. 3 hours of molecular structures and reaction mechanisms. I walked out feeling like my brain had been put through a blender. But I'd studied hard, and I knew the material. The next day was calculus, which went better. Then statistics, then literature, then finally my last exam, which was intro psychology. By the time I finished that last test, I was exhausted but relieved. I'd made it through my first semester of college despite everything that had happened with Richard. A week later, grades posted online. I logged into the student portal holding my breath. All A's. I'd maintained my 4.0 GPA for the entire semester. I sat there staring at the screen feeling this weird mix of emotions. Pride because I'd worked incredibly hard for those grades. Relief because I'd proven I could handle Northwestern's difficulty. But also this bitter satisfaction knowing I'd done it all without Richard's help. He'd tried to take credit for sending me to college, but these grades were mine. Every single one of them earned through my own effort while dealing with his betrayal and the family chaos that followed. Maya screamed when I showed her my grades and insisted we go out to celebrate. We went to this little restaurant near campus, and she bought me dinner with money from her campus job. She raised her soda and made a toast to me surviving my first semester and proving Richard wrong about everything. I clinked my glass against hers and felt genuinely happy for the first time in weeks. While we were eating, my phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. Carson Daniels had posted a comment on Richard's page. I opened it and read what he wrote. He said he was disappointed in Richard for misrepresenting the situation with my education. He said he'd always respected Richard, but learning the truth about the broken promises and stolen credit had changed his view. Then he praised my academic achievements and said I should be proud of what I'd accomplished on my own. Within an hour, his comment had 50 likes and a dozen shares. Other people from Richard's social circle were commenting their agreement and sharing it to their own pages. Richard's carefully built reputation was crumbling more with each passing day. I showed Maya, and she grinned and said karma was real and it was beautiful to watch. Winter break came, and I packed my things at Northwestern, knowing I wasn't going back to the house with the pool and the 6 bedrooms. I called Grandma and asked if I could stay with her instead. She said yes before I finished asking. When I arrived at her place in Florida, she showed me her craft room. She'd moved all her sewing stuff into the garage and set up a twin bed with new sheets. There was a small desk by the window, and she'd hung curtains that matched the bedspread. The room smelled like lavender from the sachets she'd put in the dresser drawers. I set my suitcase down and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since August. This space was mine without conditions or broken promises attached to it. Grandma made dinner that first night, and we sat at her little kitchen table eating pot roast while she told me about her church friends and their various medical issues. Normal grandma stuff that felt like the safest thing in the world after months of family chaos. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The second day home, Mom showed up at Grandma's door carrying a bag from the bakery. Grandma let her in, and then made herself scarce by going to check her mailbox even though the mail had already come. Mom and I sat on Grandma's floral couch, and she set the bakery bag on the coffee table between us like a peace offering. She looked older than I remembered. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there at the start of the semester. She asked how my finals went, and I told her about making Dean's List again. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Then she said she needed to talk to me about everything that happened. I waited. She took a breath and started talking about the past 8 years. She said she knew Richard had issues with exaggerating and making promises he might not keep. She'd seen it before we got married, but she ignored the warning signs because she was struggling financially as a single mom, and he offered security. She said the house and the cars and the vacations made her feel safe for the first time since my dad left. She admitted she chose that feeling of safety over protecting me when Richard broke his promise. Her voice cracked when she said she sat silent at that dinner in August because she was scared of losing her comfortable life. She said watching me post the truth on Facebook and seeing everyone's reactions made her realize she'd been complicit in his treatment of me. She apologized for not standing up for me when it mattered most. I sat there processing her words and feeling this complicated mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to hug her and tell her it was okay. Part of me was still angry that she'd chosen financial security over me. I told her I appreciated her being honest about what happened and why she made the choices she did. But I also said I needed time before I could trust her again. 8 years of watching her beam while Richard made promises, and then sitting silent when he broke them, had damaged something between us. I said I wanted to rebuild our relationship, but it had to be at my pace and on my terms. She nodded and wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. She said she understood, and she'd work to earn back my trust however long it took. She said she was proud of me for standing up for myself, even though it meant exposing the family problems publicly. We sat there for a few more minutes in awkward silence. Then Grandma came back inside with a handful of junk mail and asked if anyone wanted tea. Mom left shortly after that, but she hugged me before she went, and it felt different from hugs from before. Less automatic, more careful. 3 days later, I was helping Grandma organize her pantry when someone knocked on the door. Grandma went to answer it, and I heard a familiar voice that made my stomach drop. Haley was standing on the porch looking exhausted and very pregnant. Her belly was huge under an old sweatshirt and her face was puffy. She asked if she could talk to me. I felt anger surge up immediately. This was the same person who'd called me selfish and said I was fine because I had loans. The same person who'd taken my college fund and let her boyfriend waste it. Now she was showing up at my grandmother's house asking for help. I wanted to tell her to leave. But Grandma invited her inside before I could say anything. Grandma had this way of treating everyone like they deserved kindness, even when they probably didn't. She led Haley to the living room and offered her tea. Haley sat down heavily in the armchair and started crying. Not quiet tears, but full-body sobs that shook her shoulders. She said her boyfriend had left 2 weeks ago. Just packed his stuff and drove off in the truck he'd bought with my college money. She was broke because he'd spent everything Richard gave her. She was 7 months pregnant with no money for baby supplies or medical bills. She didn't know what to do, and her mom in Colorado couldn't help because she was barely making ends meet herself. Grandma brought her tea and sat down on the couch. Haley kept crying and talking between sobs. She said she knew the $60,000 was supposed to be my college fund. She said when her dad offered it to her, she knew it was wrong, but she convinced herself she needed it more because of the baby. She said she let her boyfriend control the money because she thought he'd use it responsibly. She admitted now that the money had enabled his gambling and his reckless spending. She said she should have been more careful and more responsible. She looked at me with red eyes and said she was sorry. She said when she called me in October and I told her the money was gone, she got defensive because she felt guilty. She knew she'd taken something that wasn't meant for her, and she'd wasted it. She said calling me selfish was easier than admitting she was the one who'd made terrible choices. She said she'd spent the past 2 months thinking about what she'd done and how she'd treated me. She apologized for her message and for everything else. I sat there watching her cry and feeling my anger start to shift into something more complicated. I was still mad about what she'd done, still hurt by her calling me selfish when she was the one who'd taken my college fund. But looking at her sitting there pregnant and broke and scared, I could see she was paying for her choices in ways that felt almost worse than what she'd done to me. I didn't forgive her completely. That wasn't something I could do in one conversation. But I softened enough to help in a practical way. I went to Grandma's computer and pulled up websites for social services in Haley's area, programs for pregnant women, organizations that provided baby supplies and parenting classes. Resources for emergency housing assistance. I wrote down phone numbers and contact information. Grandma added some names of organizations her church worked with that helped young mothers. We gave Haley the list and she took it with shaking hands. She thanked us multiple times before she left. She looked slightly less hopeless walking back to her car than she had walking up to the door. The week before Christmas, my phone rang with a number I recognized. Tanner Joyce. I answered, and he said he needed to tell me something about Richard's employment situation. He said the company had been conducting a review of Richard's position following my Facebook post. Multiple colleagues had come forward with concerns about Richard's pattern of exaggerating and misrepresenting things. Apparently, Richard had been telling people at work inflated stories about his accomplishments and his family situation for years. My post had opened the floodgates, and other people felt comfortable speaking up about inconsistencies they'd noticed. Tanner said the company had decided Richard's lack of integrity and poor judgment made him unsuitable for his leadership position. They were demoting him from regional director to a standard management role. Tanner said this would be effective January 1st. I felt shocked hearing how severe the professional consequences were. I'd known his job might be affected when his boss saw my post, but I hadn't expected a full demotion. Tanner said the company took integrity seriously, especially for people in leadership positions who represented the brand. I asked what this meant for Richard's salary, and Tanner explained that his pay would drop from $300,000 to about $150,000. Still a comfortable salary, but a significant cut to his lifestyle. No more Tesla, no more European vacations, no more 6-bedroom house with a pool. Tanner said the company was giving Richard a chance to rebuild trust in a lower stakes role, where his decisions affected fewer people. If he could demonstrate consistent integrity and judgment over the next year, they might consider promoting him again. But for now, the demotion was final. I thanked Tanner for letting me know, and he said he hoped I was doing well at Northwestern. He said what I'd accomplished despite Richard's betrayal was impressive, and I should be proud. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone, trying to process what I'd just heard. My Facebook post had cost Richard half his salary and his prestigious title. Part of me felt guilty about the severity of the consequences, but another part of me felt like this was just Richard finally facing the results of his own choices and behavior. Mom called before I could even tell her about my conversation with Tanner. Her voice sounded different through the phone, lighter somehow despite what she was saying. She told me Richard had been demoted at work, and the news was already spreading through his professional circles. I listened while she explained the salary cut and the loss of his regional director title. She said maybe this would force him to look at his choices and think about what really mattered. Her tone carried a strange relief that surprised me more than the news itself. She wasn't defending him or making excuses. She sounded like someone who'd been holding her breath for years and finally let it out. We talked for 20 minutes about the demotion and what it meant for their household finances. She mentioned selling the Mercedes and possibly downsizing the house. I realized she was planning for a future that didn't include Richard's inflated salary. She asked how I was doing at Grandma's and whether I needed anything. The conversation felt more honest than any we'd had in months. When we hung up, I sat on Grandma's couch staring at my phone and processing everything that had happened in the past week. Christmas Eve arrived cold and quiet. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard that contained only 7 words. I hope you're happy now. No apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd done, just blame directed at me for exposing his lies. I read the message 3 times before screenshotting it and adding it to my evidence folder. Maya had suggested I document everything, and this text proved Richard still saw himself as the victim. I showed it to Grandma, who shook her head and said some people never learned. I didn't respond to Richard's message. There was nothing to say to someone who couldn't take responsibility for breaking an 8-year promise and stealing credit for achievements he didn't fund. I saved the screenshot with all the other documentation and tried to focus on the peaceful evening ahead. Grandma had made cookies, and we watched old movies while snow fell outside her windows. The house smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, and I felt safer there than I had in months at the place I used to call home. Christmas morning was simple and calm. Mom arrived around 10 with presents and a nervous smile. We ate breakfast together at Grandma's small kitchen table and opened gifts without any drama or tension. Nobody mentioned Richard or the demotion or my Facebook post. Instead, we talked about my biology class and the research project I was planning for spring semester. Grandma told stories about her church choir and the upcoming Easter musical they were preparing. Mom asked questions about my roommate and campus life, and seemed genuinely interested in hearing about Northwestern. The conversation felt normal in a way that family gatherings hadn't felt in years. We had turkey sandwiches for lunch because Grandma said she was too old to cook a full Christmas dinner for 3 people. Mom laughed at that. Really laughed. And I realized I hadn't heard her laugh freely in a long time. The afternoon passed quietly with board games and more cookies. When Mom left around 6, she hugged me tight and whispered that she was proud of me. I hugged her back and felt the first small crack in the wall that had built up between us. The day after Christmas, Violet Cameron knocked on Grandma's door carrying a tin of homemade cookies and a red envelope. I hadn't expected to see her, but she said she'd been meaning to stop by since she heard I was staying with Grandma for break. We invited her in for tea, and she sat at the kitchen table talking about how the whole neighborhood had been discussing what happened with Richard. She said she'd been telling everyone the real story about my college fund, and how my grandmother had stepped in to save my education. Other people in their social circle had reached out to her asking how they could help. Violet handed me the red envelope and told me to open it. Inside was a Christmas card with a personal note and a check for $500 made out to me. She said it was for textbooks or whatever I needed for school. I felt my throat tighten as I read her note about believing in my future and wanting to support my education. She explained that several other family friends wanted to contribute too, because they were disgusted by Richard's behavior. I thanked her multiple times while trying not to cry. She patted my hand and said I deserved every bit of support I received. After Violet left, I sat with Grandma processing what had just happened. The $500 check felt both generous and uncomfortable. I told Grandma I didn't want to become a charity case, someone people felt sorry for and donated money to out of pity. She set down her tea and looked at me seriously. She said accepting help wasn't weakness or charity. It was allowing people to live their values by supporting someone who deserved it. She reminded me that I'd worked hard for 8 years based on a promise Richard made and broke. These people weren't pitying me. They were standing up for what was right and showing Richard that his actions had consequences. She said every dollar they gave was also a statement that they wouldn't tolerate his lies and manipulation. I thought about that perspective while holding Violet's check. Maybe she was right. Maybe accepting their support was actually holding Richard accountable in a way that mattered to him, showing him that people valued integrity over his false image. Over the next few days, more money arrived. Richard's aunt sent a check with a note saying she was ashamed of her nephew's behavior. 2 of Mom's old friends from before she married Richard contributed $100 each. Carson Daniels, Richard's former golf buddy, sent $250 with an apology for not seeing through Richard's act sooner. I kept a list of every contribution in a notebook, writing down names and amounts and the kind words people included with their gifts. By New Year's Eve, the total reached almost $8,000. It wouldn't cover a full year at Northwestern, but it was significant. I showed Grandma the list and she smiled while reading through all the names. She said this was what community looked like when people chose to do the right thing. The money wouldn't replace what Richard had stolen, but it reduced the burden on her life insurance savings. I felt grateful and overwhelmed and still slightly uncomfortable with accepting so much help from people who didn't owe me anything. Grandma pulled out her financial records and we sat down together to create a real budget for my remaining college costs. We spread papers across her dining room table and calculated everything: tuition, housing, meal plan, books, fees, transportation. Then we added up my resources. The $8,000 in community contributions, the money I'd saved from my campus job, the remaining balance from Grandma's $40,000 payment. We worked through different scenarios and spending plans. Grandma suggested I could take fewer credits in summer to reduce costs, but I wanted to stay on track for 4-year graduation. We figured out that with careful spending and my part-time work earnings, we could make her original $40,000 stretch further than we'd thought. The community support had bought us breathing room. I wouldn't have to work excessive hours during the semester, and Grandma wouldn't have to dip as deeply into her life insurance money. We finished the budget around dinner time, and I felt relieved seeing the numbers work out on paper. Grandma made me promise something while we were putting away the financial papers. She said I needed to focus on my studies and not take on too many work hours trying to pay everything back quickly. Her gift was an investment in my future, not a loan I needed to stress about repaying. She said the best return she could get was me graduating with honors and becoming successful in whatever career I chose. She wanted me to have the education and opportunities she never got. I promised I'd prioritize my classes and not let work interfere with my grades. She nodded and said that was all she wanted to hear. Then she told me about my grandfather, who died before I was born, and how he'd always valued education above everything else. She said he would have been proud to see his life insurance money going toward my Northwestern degree. That made me cry a little, thinking about a grandfather I never met investing in my future through Grandma's choice to help me. New Year's Eve arrived and I spent it writing thank you notes to everyone who'd contributed money or public support. I sat at Grandma's kitchen table with nice stationery she'd bought for me and wrote personal messages to each person. I thanked Violet for her generosity and for standing up for the truth. I thanked Richard's aunt for her support despite the family awkwardness. I thanked Carson for his apology and his contribution. Each note took time because I wanted people to know their help meant something real to me. Around 9, Maya video called from her family's New Year's party. I could hear music and voices in the background while she asked how my break was going. I told her about the community support and the budget planning with Grandma. She said I was lucky to have people who really cared about me, and I realized she was right. Richard had taken my college fund, but I'd gained something more valuable. I'd found out who actually supported me and who just pretended. Maya and I talked until almost midnight, and when we hung up, I felt genuinely happy about starting the new year. Mom called on New Year's Day with news I'd been half expecting. She said she'd decided to file for separation from Richard after he refused to go to marriage counseling or apologize to me. She was moving into an apartment in January and starting over on her own. Her voice shook a little when she told me, but she also sounded determined. She said watching me refuse to accept Richard's treatment had shown her that she didn't have to accept it either. She'd spent years trying to keep peace and maintain their lifestyle, but the cost had been too high. She'd lost her relationship with me and her self-respect in the process. I listened while she talked about the apartment she'd found and her plans to get a job. She'd been a stay-at-home wife since marrying Richard, but before that she'd worked in marketing. She thought she could find something in that field again. I told her I was proud of her for making this choice, and I meant it. Our relationship had been damaged by her silence and complicity, but hearing her take action to leave Richard felt like a first step toward healing. She asked if we could have lunch when I got back to campus in January, and I said yes. We still had a lot to work through, but at least she was finally standing up for herself and for me. I cried a little that night thinking about Mom finally choosing herself and me over Richard's ego. She'd spent 8 years trying to keep the peace and maintain their lifestyle, but watching me refuse to accept Richard's treatment had shown her that she didn't have to accept it either. The next morning, she called again to talk through the apartment she'd found and her plans to look for marketing jobs. She sounded nervous but determined, and I told her I was proud of her for making this choice. Our relationship had been damaged by her silence when Richard gave away my college fund, but hearing her take action to leave him felt like a first step toward healing something broken between us. 3 days later, an email appeared in my inbox with a law firm's name in the sender line. I opened it and felt my stomach drop as I read the formal language. Richard's lawyer was demanding I sign a statement saying I'd exaggerated the situation on social media. The tone was threatening, mentioning potential defamation claims if I didn't comply within 10 business days. The lawyer wrote that my post had caused serious damage to Richard's professional reputation and personal relationships, and that I needed to publicly retract my statements and acknowledge they were embellished for sympathy. I read it 3 times, hands shaking a little, before forwarding it to Mom with a message asking what I should do. Mom called within minutes, her voice tight with anger. She said she was contacting her own lawyer immediately and told me not to respond to Richard's attorney. I spent the rest of the day feeling anxious and checking my phone constantly, wondering if Richard could actually sue me for telling the truth. That evening, Mom called back with her lawyer on the line. The lawyer asked me to send over all my documentation, the texts where Richard promised to pay, the emails about Northwestern, the video from the wedding reception. I uploaded everything to a secure folder and sent the link, then waited while they reviewed it. The lawyer called me directly the next morning and said I had nothing to worry about. Everything I posted was true and provable through the documentation I'd provided. She said Richard's lawyer was making empty threats, hoping I'd get scared and back down. She asked permission to respond on my behalf, and I agreed immediately. Within hours, Mom's lawyer sent a formal response to Richard's attorney pointing out that Richard was the one who'd made false claims on social media by taking credit for paying for my education when he'd contributed $0. The letter included copies of all my documentation and noted that if anyone had grounds for a defamation claim, it would be me against Richard for his fraudulent posts. The threatening tone disappeared completely after that. Richard's lawyer sent a brief acknowledgement and the whole thing went silent. The day before I was supposed to return to Northwestern for spring semester, my phone buzzed with a text from Haley. I almost didn't open it, expecting another complaint about how I'd ruined her father's life. Instead, she wrote that she'd enrolled in a program for young mothers that would help her finish her associate degree while providing childcare for the baby. She thanked me for the resource information I'd given her at Grandma's house and said she was trying to get her life together. She wrote that she knew she'd messed up by taking my college fund, and by the way she'd treated me afterward. She said she hoped things worked out for me at Northwestern. I sat on my bed at Grandma's house staring at the message for a long time before responding. I typed that I hoped things worked out for her and the baby, that the program sounded like a good opportunity. I kept it short and didn't promise anything about our relationship going forward. I wasn't ready to have a real connection with her, but I could wish her well from a distance. She sent back a simple thanks and a heart emoji, and I felt some of the tension I'd been carrying about her situation release a little. Going back to Northwestern felt different this time. I packed my stuff in Grandma's guest room and hugged her goodbye at the airport, promising to call every Sunday. The flight back to Chicago felt lighter somehow, like I wasn't carrying the same weight I'd had when I left for winter break. The family drama had settled into a new normal where Mom was leaving Richard, Haley was trying to fix her life, and Richard was facing consequences for his actions. I wasn't carrying his broken promises anymore, or wondering if he'd ever acknowledge what he'd done. That part of my life was over, and I could focus on the school without the constant background stress of his manipulation. Maya met me at the dorm with coffee and helped me unpack my suitcase. We caught up on her break while organizing my desk, and she asked if I wanted to room together again next year. I said yes immediately, grateful to have a friend who'd seen me through the worst of the family chaos and still wanted to live with me. A few days into the semester, I saw a flyer for a student organization supporting first-generation and low-income students. I went to the first meeting and found myself sitting in a circle with 15 other students sharing stories about financial struggles and family complications around college. When it was my turn, I told them about Richard's broken promise and my grandmother's sacrifice and Haley getting my college fund. Several people nodded like they understood exactly what I meant, and afterward, 3 different students came up to share their own experiences with family members who'd let them down. Talking about it openly with people who got it helped me process everything that had happened in a way that felt healing instead of just painful. Mom started therapy in February and called me every Sunday to update me on her progress. She talked about working through codependency issues and figuring out who she was outside of her marriage to Richard. She'd gotten a job interview at a marketing firm and was nervous but excited about the possibility of working again after 8 years as a stay-at-home wife. Our conversations were still sometimes awkward, but they were honest in a way they'd never been before. She apologized again for staying silent when Richard gave away my college fund, and I told her I was working on forgiving her, but it would take time. She said she understood and that she'd wait as long as I needed. Richard made no further attempts to contact me after the lawyer situation disappeared. Mom told me during one of our Sunday calls that he'd moved into a condo near his office and seemed focused on keeping his reduced-level management job. She said he'd stopped posting on social media entirely and had lost touch with most of his golf buddies and social circle after my post exposed his lies. She thought he'd finally accepted that he'd destroyed our relationship permanently and wasn't going to try to fix it. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness hearing that. Relief that I wouldn't have to deal with more manipulation or fake apologies. Sadness that 8 years of him calling me his daughter had ended with him just giving up and walking away. I applied for summer internships in March, focusing on nonprofits that worked with college access programs. The application process felt easier than I expected because I could write honestly about my experience navigating financial barriers and understanding what low-income students faced when trying to get to college. 3 organizations called me for interviews, and I talked about Richard's broken promise and how my grandmother's sacrifice taught me that education access shouldn't depend on whether your family keeps their word. The Chicago Education Initiative offered me a position 2 weeks later, working with their college prep program for high school juniors from underserved communities. The salary was $30 an hour for 20 hours a week over the summer, which would cover my textbooks for sophomore year and give me some breathing room in my budget. I accepted immediately and felt excited about doing work that actually mattered instead of just earning money. Finals wrapped up in early May, and I maintained my 4.0 for the second semester straight. Grandma called the day grades posted and said her church wanted to throw a celebration for me making Dean's List again. I tried to tell her it wasn't necessary, but she insisted that her congregation had been praying for me all year and wanted to recognize my achievements. The celebration happened on a Sunday afternoon in the church fellowship hall with about 40 people from her congregation. Grandma introduced me to everyone as her granddaughter who was thriving at Northwestern despite family challenges, and people kept coming up to congratulate me and tell me how proud they were. Several older women hugged me and said they'd been following my story through Grandma's updates, and one man handed me a $50 bill for textbooks, even though I tried to refuse it. The whole thing felt overwhelming in a good way, being surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my success, without any ulterior motives or expectations beyond wanting me to do well. Mom called me the next week with news that her divorce from Richard was finalized. She sounded lighter somehow, like a weight had lifted, and told me she'd been seeing someone new for the past month. His name was Cody. He worked as an accountant, and he treated her with respect and kindness she hadn't experienced in years. She said watching how Grandma supported me unconditionally taught her what healthy relationships actually looked like, and she wasn't going to settle for less anymore. I felt genuinely happy for her, and told her I wanted to meet Cody when I came home for the summer. Finishing my freshman year felt surreal after everything that happened. I sat in my dorm room the last day before moving out and thought about how speaking the truth on Facebook changed my entire life. I had my education at Northwestern, my grandmother's support that never wavered, a relationship with my mom that was healing slowly, and the knowledge that I didn't have to accept broken promises or let people lie about my life. Richard lost his reputation, his marriage, and his high-paying job, but I gained clarity about who actually mattered and the confidence to stand up for myself when something was wrong.